just too violent for their kids. Carol Lynn joins us live now.
Understand that these are not harmless toys.
So, the giant Sega Corporation recently introduced a voluntary system to
In 1993, Mortal Kombat sparked major controversy, especially with parents, due to its graphic violence and realistic bloodshed. And the media couldn't keep their hands off it. Shortly after the controversy was dying down, Midway released Mortal Kombat II. And all us kids cared about was a port that was going to live up to its arcade counterpart. But did any of them? We're going to find out right now on Arcade versus Console.
How much violence they're getting.
The objective is to finish off your opponent violently. Another method is decapitation.
Test your might. Test
Warning
your might.
labels on toys that can potentially damage children's life.
It's there, so I'm not going to try to hide myself from that.
Fatality.
Welcome back to the channel, everybody, and today we are going to dig deep into the corners of gaming history with Mortal Kombat 2. Real quick, if you enjoy this video, please remember to give it a thumbs up, and if you're not subscribed, please consider subscribing to the channel if you enjoyed this content. Toasty! With that out of the way, I want to mention one crazy fact about this game right up front. Mortal Kombat 2 was developed in just 10 months. That's right, the team at Midway worked tirelessly, often pulling all-nighters to get the game ready for the April 1993 arcade release. And not only did they manage to accomplish this feat, but they also managed to upgrade the scale of the game. The game utilized a higher resolution than its predecessor, resulting in more detailed and crisper character sprites and backgrounds, as well as higher frames of animation per character, providing smoother and more fluid movements during gameplay. The improvement made the combat feel more lifelike and dynamic. In 1993, it was pretty insane to think that they actually were able to achieve this, and not only achieve it, but exceptionally well. Mortal Kombat 2 turned out to be everything fans wanted and more. So reception of the game was overwhelmingly positive. And by the way, MK2 was the first game to use Midway's DCS sound system. Alongside all these other great things that the game is toting, it was filled with Easter eggs, such as Jade, Smoke, and Noob Sabat, whose name is a combination of the last names of Ed Boon and John Tobias. And if you're watching this and you don't know who these guys are because you've been living under a rock or you're not a real gamer, they're the creators of the game and can be seen here taking some serious media heat for the game violence back in 1995. Now fast forward a year and we're getting close to the console port releases. And it's important to note before I go down the rabbit hole of the console ports that Mortal Kombat was the key game leading to the 1993 Senate hearings on video game violence, which led to the creation of the Entertainment Software Rating Board, or what we know as the ESRB. Of course, at the time, that did not stop the media from making a big deal out of video game violence every chance they got throughout the mid-90s. Now, obviously, a big factor in the production and continuance of the Mortal Kombat series was the money involved. Oh yes, there was money to be made. And there was also money to be spent. According to an article in the San Francisco Chronicle, Acclaim had spent $50 million on developing, manufacturing, and marketing the game for consoles. In 1993, that's a considerable amount of money, but when you look at how many console ports they actually made, it kind of makes sense. And in many ways, Mortal Kombat 2 was the pinnacle of the series, as well as console ports of its time. Which is why what you're about to see might just blow your mind. But not before we watch some super cringy 90s commercials. Okay, here we go.
That's fun. So I go in and shoot this woman in the head, and people are screaming and running all over, and there's blood everywhere. There's this cop next to me who sees what I did. He's got body armor, so I can't shoot him. So I throw gasoline on him and light it, and he screams and runs around, and he died. There's this prostitute, and they're super hard to kill. So I grab a machete and cut her head off.
And this. It's so concerning. The new update for Animal Crossing has mandatory anger management classes. You know, this type of violence is really disappointing. So here's a few very interesting things that you may or may not have known about MK2. And two of the big ones that I remember. If you beat MK1, you know that Liu Kang or whoever beats Shang Tsung in Goro's lair. So I'm not sure if they changed the background level to Warrior's Shrine to give it a little bit more finesse in MK2's intro, but it's technically not the right spot. Back in the 90s, one of the huge mysteries was surrounding a character who everybody called Scarlet, who eventually became a real character in the game. But to make things more confusing back then, there was actually an MK2 guide that had pictures of palette-swapped characters. People swore up and down that Scarlet was a real character you could unlock in the game. But the reality of the situation hit even harder when people were able to data mine and figure out that this was just a simple bug causing a palette swap in the character sprites, which is technically what was originally mentioned in the guidebook. Well, fast forward to 2011 and Ed Boon actually made Scarlet a character based on all of this lore, which is crazy and shows you how much of a fan-centric game Mortal Kombat is, or was? With that being said, I just decided to throw in a quick list of trivia from Mortal Kombat Wiki so you guys can see a lot of the other crazy stuff that's kind of hidden in this game or maybe forgotten about or unknown, like Nintendo realizing it was a bad idea to leave blood out of the game. And it even worked with X-Band online play in the early 90s. There are also mentions of other games that Mortal Kombat 2 is directly connected to. The rare and expensive, really crappy PlayStation version, as well as characters like Ermac, who didn't become a playable character until Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3. And this is definitely one of the cases where Genesis does what Nintendo don't when it comes to the soundtrack, because they were able to keep it more faithful to the original arcade version and also remix it. And of course, we all know about those PlayStation 3 games that, well, got pulled off the PlayStation Store platform. RIP! Along with a couple other cool factoids. Okay, so obviously the arcade version takes the cake. We all know that. But, this is one of those games where the console port, the 16-bit console port, actually came pretty close to the feel and quality of the arcade. And generally speaking, all of the ports played pretty well. Well, with the exception of maybe a couple. But either way, if you're looking at a time of relevancy, all the ports that were released during that time were particularly good ports per their platform. Let's breeze over what I've got. This was purchased at Woolworths, and this was probably around the time I was, 13, 14 maybe. I was one of those weird kids who would just cut the saran wrap and then preserve everything. But yeah, this is a really neat version. Handheld version is freaking awesome. Okay. Then the Super Nintendo version. I actually got this one later on, after I got the Game Boy version, and it was just the cartridge. I didn't have the CIB, I just had the cartridge. So this is a repro box and instruction manual, but the cartridge is an original MK2 SNES cartridge. And then the Sega Saturn version I actually got more recently. But between this and the PlayStation version, gosh, they're potentially could have been so good. But they both definitely have their flaws. Now these, I don't know if you can really count because, you know, these came out way later. These are obviously faithful to the arcade because this is like arcade emulated technically. So yeah, and I know that there's other collections or ways that you could play MK2. And for the Genesis and 32X experience, I do use a Mega Drive Mini. Shut up, don't judge me. Another thing I really hated about this was it used one of those plasticky cheap-ass retainers, which I felt like is a sign to that this game was unfinished. All right, now that we've got everything loaded up, here is a quick overview of the character select screen on each of the major platforms. I am going to breeze through each version so that we can all have a look and see on the CRT as well as screen captured. But this will give you some quick close-up context. What I really loved about the Game Boy version was how smooth it felt. If you played the first one on Game Boy, you would know that it didn't run very well. And this was like a huge step up, a huge difference. Now with Game Boys, I really used to carry them around in my pocket. So having this game in your back pocket was pretty cool because, you know, not only was everybody obsessed with it, but it was a really fun game to play and take with you wherever you found yourself going. Believe it or not, I did used to have it on Game Gear. Long ago, I sold all of that, but the Game Gear version is really good. Second to the Game Boy, but looks better, in my humble opinion. The Super Nintendo version. This version of Mortal Kombat II is an exceptional port. Now, not everybody knows this, but there's a hidden intro with Shao Kahn and Kintaro. All you have to do to access it is when you turn the game on, hold the L and R button on the Super Nintendo controller. One of the major things that the Super Nintendo version was missing was the arcade storyboard intro. This was kind of disheartening just because the rest of the game was done so well and you're like, how dare they leave the one thing out that could have made this thing feel like the perfect arcade port. But aside from that, there's not a whole lot about this port that I didn't like. I mean, it was an incredible step up from the first Mortal Kombat, and obviously they added blood and everything was very smooth. It's an absolutely amazing port when it comes to 16-bit consoles at that time. There's supposed to be a beta version of this that exists that has like a bunch of glitches in it that people thought were really cool. I've never seen it or played it, but overall I absolutely love this version. Now, the interesting thing about the Sega Saturn port is that Sega Saturn was like notoriously good for having awesome ports of 2D arcade fighting games. And if you're only looking at this game from a visuals point of view, it looks incredibly beautiful. I mean, the sprites are good, the characters are big, everything about it looks pretty and akin to the arcade. But unfortunately, beneath all those beautiful sprites, there's a ton of problems. I mean, this is a very unfinished feeling game. While the game technically doesn't have any loading time throughout it, loading time during the fights is noticeable. During Shang Tsung morphs and before fatalities, not to mention notably missing sounds. But there was hope for Sega fans.
But they're sitting here telling me that this is a 32-bit system, 32X. You know, it's so powerful for your Genesis.
And honestly, it was probably the best alternative if you had a 32X. I mean, those things were like $200. But playing it now, it's not as good as I remember it being for some reason. And the music isn't as good as I remember it being either. But it is definitely, 100% without a doubt, one of the most notable ports of this game, as well as the homebrew MK2 32X arcade version. I did want to pull up the Sega Saturn and PlayStation version for a quick side-by-side comparison. You guys will kind of see that the PlayStation has a little bit more loading time, but they both suffer from the same issues. Essentially, they're both very incomplete, and they're missing sounds and have intermittent loading times throughout fighting and before fatalities. But if I had to pick one version, I would pick the Sega Saturn version without a doubt. And it feels closer to the arcade because it doesn't have any loading screens, but that's about it. Real quick, I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a better look at the PlayStation version here so you can see like how plagued it is with loading times as you're playing the game in the middle of fights. This next version is kind of funny. It's on the Amiga. I believe this is the Amiga 500 version, which it didn't really matter which version of the Amiga you played it on. It was pretty much like the Sega Master System on steroids, which is great. I mean, for what it was a good port, and anybody who had an Amiga would have loved to play it on there. But again, in an overall sense, you can really see that they put a lot of time into developing these ports, and for the most part, they turned out really well. And one other piece of trivia that I forgot to mention earlier is Ed Boon's hidden face. It really is him. So here's a list of all the console ports: Sega Genesis, SNES, Game Boy, Game Gear, Master System, 32X, PlayStation, Sega Saturn. Then your home computer ports: Amiga, MS-DOS, and the next-gen ports. By the way, the MS-DOS version had really crappy MIDI music and it was subpar. So what's my favorite version? Well, I'm sure you've already figured it out, but it's Super Nintendo. And if you're a fan of MK, I would definitely recommend checking out these 3 channels, which are my 3 favorite that cover MK stuff: Bushy Stallion, Killer Arcade Games, and Riddick's Classic Arcade. Remember to let me know in the comments which port was your favorite, and feel free to add on to any trivia I might have left out. Thanks for watching, and peace out.